Welcome to this special edition of the TDI podcast series, Suits and Boots, brought to you as part of TDI's strategic partnership with the Mining Indaba 2025. I'm Assheton, CEO at TDI, and I'm joined today by three representatives from different parts of the mining industry who will be speaking at this year's Mining Indaba event. Over the course of this series of special edition podcasts, we'll be discussing the key themes of this year's event. Today's topic is Maximising Africa's Critical Mineral Endowment, and we'll be talking about how African countries can be positioned as a partner of choice in the energy transition, and what needs to be done to ensure Africa becomes a global minerals leader and future-proof its industry. I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Theo Archeampong. Theo is a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, where he works on how the energy transition, natural resource governance, and global value chain trade affect Africa. He has more than 15 years of experience as an economist and political risk analyst in the extractive industry, public financial management, and academia. Also with me today is George Bennett. George is CEO of Rainbow Rare Earths. He has around 30 years experience in mining, finance, and senior management. And he's led a number of resource companies, including MDM Engineering. And under MDM Engineering, he oversaw the development of some 22 mining process plants and mining infrastructure projects across Africa. George has also been partner and director of a number of leading stockbroking and corporate advisory businesses. Welcome, George. And finally, Gareth Walsh. Gareth leads the Tony Blair Institute's energy and climate advisory work across the world. He supports leaders in developing their energy systems, navigating the global energy transition, harnessing technology to adapt to climate change, and engaging in climate diplomacy. George has spent more than 10 years at the Tony Blair Institute, supporting global leaders in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean as they develop and deliver strategies and policies. Prior to his current role, Gareth worked in energy trading and regulation. Welcome, Gareth. So let's start with a question. How critical are critical minerals to Africa's energy transition? And that does sound like a little bit of an odd question, but really what I'm referring to here is, are the critical minerals that are demanded globally the same as those minerals that are demanded for the African continent for its development? Gareth, perhaps I could turn to you first.
Thanks. I guess before answering that question, it's maybe just worth being clear that Africa's energy transition needs are pretty different to the rest of the world. So we do a lot of work in Europe and East Asia, where it's really about moving from fossil fuels to renewables. In Africa, where half the continent doesn't have access to electricity, it's often about helping households and businesses transition to modern energy, i.e. electricity, and also within the electricity sector, helping homes and businesses move from expensive diesel generation to on-grid power. So you look at a country like Nigeria, where sort of 1 in 12 households actually have a generator. So I'd say, based on that, minerals are critical to Africa's energy transition and CRM in two respects. Firstly, Africa needs clean energy investment. If you look across Africa in general, the sort of least cost set of investments in the power sector is some combination of heavy investment in solar or wind, married with investments in gas or hydro, depending on the geography and what they have. And the challenge with this really is that this investment is incredibly capital intensive. The energy transition is largely transitioning from variable costs via fuel to upfront costs. And from an African perspective, this is a huge investment challenge. So only 2% of the global investment in clean energy is actually flowing into Africa, which leads me to sort of the second point why CRM is potentially so critical to Africa's energy transition, which is really that Africa needs these big consumers that mining companies and some of the downstream industries represent to actually support it to secure the energy investment. So it's a kind of two-sided coin, if you like. In most African countries, the biggest barrier to investment in the energy sector is the repayment risk of the buyers. You've got inefficient utilities, mostly state-owned, selling to low-income consumers, usually with highly politicized tariffs that are well below the cost of energy, which represents an enormous risk for investors. And there's the possibility for sort of mining companies and downstream industry that process these minerals to sort of break that challenge, if you like. They can be a huge energy consumer. They can provide the long-term demand needed to drive investment. And I guess if you just want to think about the scale of the demand from these guys, so in Zambia, mining contributes to about half of the country's demand. In Mozambique, where we're doing a lot of work, Mozal, the big aluminium smelter, consumes as much power as the rest of the country combined. So I think for those two reasons, CRM are critical to Africa's transition.
Great, thanks very much. And Theo, from your point of view, in your work looking at the impact of the global energy transition on Africa, should we be framing this discussion around critical minerals for energy, or should we be framing the discussion around critical minerals for Africa's industrialization and urbanization, or are these really the same things at the end of the day?
Yeah. So thank you very much, Assheton, for the question. And I think just to re-echo a number of the points already made, and for many in Africa, whether it's policymakers or the ordinary man on the street, the conversation really is less to do with the critical minerals for its transition or for industrialization or indeed for urbanization. They are part and parcel of a complex picture that many Africans aspire to. So it's not a binary decision in that sense, that these minerals can be used very much to drive energy access and to drive and close the access gap on the continent, where often the stats show that about half of the people on the continent lack access to electricity. But at the same time, many of the countries see this as a generational opportunity to leverage these resources to close the industrialization gap. We've been talking industrialization in Africa for the last 60 or so years in the post-independence era. There were some early successes in the 60s and 70s, but since that time, a lot of the countries have struggled, particularly to be able to add value to their raw minerals before exporting to the countries that need them. And they see these mineral resources, the newfound boom, as an opportunity to leverage and close that gap. And then related to that, of course, it also creates jobs, and further downstream processing and related opportunities. And then the catalytic impact on things like research and development and innovation, and even addressing some of the infrastructure deficits that permeates a number of the countries. So it's really a multifaceted objective that many of the countries on the continent aspire to. But if you want to isolate maybe two of them, really fundamentally, it's about industrialization and it's about closing the energy access gap.
And George, Rainbow Rare Earths is focusing on the recovery of neodymium, of dysprosium and terbium and other elements. Where do these sit on the priority critical minerals list globally and for Africa?
Well, if I could just come and just talk about Africa in general, I've built 22 mines across Africa in my previous business, which was a mining engineering business. And I built copper mines, gold mines, diamond mines, platinum, uranium, a number of commodities. And I believe that, Africa is already at the forefront of many minerals, in the sense that we've got the biggest deposit of manganese, platinum. They're global, at the forefront of gold production, chromite production, and so forth. So they already are at the leading front of mining on the world stage. But unfortunately, what I've seen is that there are a lot of mines being built, a lot of projects have been developed in African countries, and the development that should be taking place, initially we see development taking place on the back of these mines being built in these countries. I mean, the first time I drove from Gator mine in Tanzania to a mine I was developing called Shanta Gold in a previous business I was involved in, it took hours and hours on that road. But 20 years later, because mining had brought, tarred roads to those areas, that trip was just literally, 1 or 2 hours, not sort of 6 or 7 hours. And that's the type of development we see mining companies bring. And of course, they're at the forefront of looking at solar now, looking at renewable energy, looking at hydropower schemes to develop cheap power to feed their mines, which has a knock-on effect for the inhabitants around those mines, which is all very positive. But unfortunately, what happens is that I've seen is that money starts developing Africa, these African countries, And then the governments start being massively corrupt. And then we don't see any progress being made in these countries. We see what's happening in West Africa with certain countries which have now, just stolen $250 million worth of gold from Barrick, in terms of just going in a military helicopter and taking this gold, and they're just confiscating it. That's basically theft. That's going to stop fixed foreign investment coming into countries for mining. If you haven't got fiscal stability, you haven't got political stability, and you haven't got governments which are not so corrupt. So we need to have a look at the corrupt governments. I mean, you look about a major oil producer on the west coast of Africa. They've been producing billions of dollars of oil for many, many years, yet that country is totally in poverty. That's because that money does not go to the corrupt governments, do not deploy that money. When you look at a country like Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or Oman in the Middle East, which has got massive oil revenues, but you don't see poverty in those countries. You see very modern cities and very modern sort of development. So I think that's one of the key issues that we need to look at in Africa. And then going to Rainbow, yes, critical minerals are very key for green energy. It goes into wind turbines, it goes into plug-in hybrids, it goes into electric vehicles. So very, very important that we can be, and that Rainbow can be one of the projects outside of China delivering these critical minerals and creating an independent supply chain outside of China to feed these green industries, be it, as I say, wind power, be it electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids, and so forth.
Thanks. So George and Theo, you both highlighted some of the things that need to happen to ensure that these significant resources of minerals are developed for the benefit of Africa, the infrastructure deficit being one, political stability being another. So Theo, is it axiomatic? Is it automatically going to happen that Africa will benefit because of critical minerals, or what do we need to do to ensure that it does?
Yeah, again, I think you've highlighted on a few of the sort of structural issues or the bottlenecks that would have to be addressed. Just having the minerals in and of itself wouldn't necessarily translate into development outcomes or closing the poverty gap, as we've seen in several other instances, not only in Africa, but in other jurisdictions, as well. And fundamentally, it comes down to some of the points that George alluded earlier, what do you do in terms of the fiscal stability, fiscal certainty, the political stability, the logistics issue that has been mentioned, but also within that component, the big issue of actually energy, right? If you want to move up the value chain and you want to do further beneficiation and processing of these minerals, you need a lot of energy to enable to do that. So let me just give some sort of context to this. If you take just the bauxite to aluminium value chain, the biggest demand for energy utilization is actually when you're running the smelter, and these smelters can consume as much as 13,000 kilowatts. So basically about 1.3 megawatt to generate 1 ton of aluminium. And these are huge energy resources that are required. And it also has to be relatively cheap in that sense. The smelters in China would be getting power at below 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And they will be then exporting that aluminium to other markets out in the world. But many of the smelters in Africa would not remain or would not be competitive if the cost of power is extraordinarily high, some in excess of 7-8 cents a kilowatt hour. So the energy for the processing of these inputs becomes extremely critical. And then, of course, in addition, the people itself, so the manpower that would work in the mines, work in the refineries, and work further downstream. Luckily, in a number of the countries that I've been to, whether we're talking about Zambia or Namibia or Ghana, you do have some good technical expertise already within the sector. They may require some bit of training or retraining, but that is relatively, from a sort of comparative advantage point of view, one that is a positive for the continent. But the big sticky issues really is about the contracts, it's about the overall business environment and the logistics that are required, and importantly, the energy that is needed to make these midstream and downstream products like the precursor cells much, much cheaper than it would come from, say, China or any other part of the world.
Gareth, what's your view on this?
I mean, just to echo the point on energy, but what's becoming increasingly important is not just the cost of energy, but the carbon intensity of the energy. So with things like the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism, we are, and other ESG rationale, right? Companies like Toyota sort of looking to decarbonize their supply chains. We're increasingly seeing a premium being put on green commodities. So if you take sort of aluminium being shipped into the EU, there's going to be a cost on every ton of CO2 that comprises of the production of that aluminium. So I think aluminium today is maybe sort of $4,000 a ton. A ton of aluminium smelted with hydropower is roughly 10 tons of CO2 less carbon intensive than a ton of aluminium produced with hydropower. So you're talking about a potential saving of like $800 or so when that gets shipped into the EU, which is sort of 20% of the value, right? So for countries looking to produce energy to feed sort of mineral processing, increasingly a factor, the carbon intensity of that energy as well. And I think this is where Africa does have a big advantage. Africa has some of the world's biggest untapped hydros all across the continent, right? Multiple projects down the Zambezi, including sort of Mpandankura that the Mozambicans are developing, the Grandinga. You've seen a lot of projects being developed in Guinea, all, of course, relatively close to sort of big mineral resources as well.
So I'd just like to add to that, and to Theo's point where, and Gareth, in terms of energy is key, as you say, and as Theo made a point, cost of energy, because we've had smelters closed down in South Africa because Eskom's energy costs just went through the roof over the last 20 years. South Africa used to be one of the lowest producers of energy in the world, or power in the world, and it's now become one of the most expensive. And we've seen smelters close down as a result of that. So you need cheap energy, you need green energy if possible in terms of hydro schemes and so forth. But also logistics are key, because if you want to go downstream, often downstream processes need a lot of reagents, and these are quite dangerous. I mean, if I look at going downstream in rare earths, we need sulfuric acid, you need sometimes hydrochloric acid, you might need some various other reagents that are quite critical. And to ship these long distances, over sort of not very good roads, is quite dangerous. And you also, so ideally, to be able to develop downstream in the rare earth space, you need to be near these critical reagents, which are expensive in the first place, and then the transport of them. So, as I say, South Africa for Rainbow is ideal because you've got all these reagents sort of manufactured in South Africa, and the ones that are important, you've got a very good road structure to get them safely to where you need them. A country like Morocco has got very good sort of chemical industries that could support downstream rare earth mineral processing going further downstream. But you'd have to look at that as well when you're assessing whether you can go downstream. Copper projects need a massive amount of sulfuric acid, so that's why they're building sulfuric acid plants in country to feed sulfuric acid rather than transport it, because of the danger of transporting sulfuric acid. So I think apart from your logistics are also very key to trying to help these mines develop and help you go downstream, further, if you want to achieve that in Africa.
I want to come back to the conversation on ancillary and auxiliary industry hubs and clusters, and also regional cooperation. But just going back to a comment that Gareth made about the EU CBAM and the expectations for the decarbonisation of the supply chains. I'm not a cynical person, but I could put on my critical thinking hat and go some of the downstream sectors that you cited as creating a demand for that, like the auto industry, and you'll see that they're struggling a little bit. And you look at the deregulation coming from the other side of the Atlantic. Who is willing to pay a premium for the cost of the decarbonation of these supply chains, and where will the finance come from for these ambitious renewable energy projects?
Look, I've had direct dealings with OEMs because, we're going to be producing separated rare earth oxides, which is key for permanent magnets. They're going to, as I say, EVs, wind turbines, plug-in hybrids. And Paddleball happens to be one of the greenest rare earth projects in the world today because we're treating a waste phosphogypsum. We're redepositing that gypsum we've treated on a lined gypsum stack, which currently those stacks are unlined, so they're leaching acid water into the environment. And we're going to be selling the phosphogypsum into the South African market. So very green, but not one of the OEMs are prepared to pay a premium for our product. They are so cost-driven, and I haven't seen it yet. That's just giving my personal experience.
Go ahead, Theo.
Yeah, no, just to add a little bit to the premium question, and it's one that comes very much strongly in a number of the policy conversations that I've been within as well. And I mean, it's all in a flux in terms of where the market is particularly going to go in the next few years, as you mentioned, with Donald Trump coming in and, the whole green agenda momentum slowing down a little bit than many market watchers had forecasted. And that, again, would have, of course, a major impact even at a project level, right, on the continent. But it wouldn't necessarily. So if you take a more medium to long-term view, it wouldn't necessarily slow down where the markets, would eventually move towards, where you'd need more of these green mineral resources that have a lower, carbon intensity in that respect. And what that basically would then mean is that the market in and of itself, or the investable hand of the market, to borrow Adam Smith, would in a way shepherd or coordinate that these products that are coming in there meet the emission intensity criteria. But I think fundamentally also has to be competitive because it's a global marketplace. And whatever is being made in Zambia or South Africa could equally have been made in China or some other place. And that is really where the fundamental question comes. The premium, yes, but a premium that still makes those within the supply chain relatively uncompetitive. I doubt that people would be willing to actually pick up, those products. And you can see very well that playing out even within aluminium, which is one of the examples that we've been talking about, and how CBAM would have a major impact on the aluminium industry and other heavy industries on the continent. And who will pay for that? If you want to build a new smelting plant and you were using hydro, that could help bring down the unit cost. But if you have to integrate, for example, carbon capture, utilization and storage, or use green hydrogen, these or some of these technologies still have major uncertainties in terms of their cost, and that would just push a number of the producers out of the market when you look at their marginal cost of supply.
Gareth Walsh.
So I agree with the sort of skepticism. I think if you look at, if you're investing in a hydro plant, if you're investing in a smelter, you're looking 20, 30 year investment period. You're going to want to join that up with an off-taker who's prepared to pay the premium for at least sort of 50 or 60% of that time for the investment to be justified. And I think at the moment with CBAM, for example, there's just too much uncertainty. There's regulatory uncertainty within the EU about the exact timing and the exact scope. But then there's just long-term uncertainty around sort of businesses within the EU. So, if it's costing them significantly more to sort of import aluminium into the EU, why would they not just sort of offshore their businesses elsewhere? So I think that is, the theory of CBAM, it sounds nice, but I think when you get to the sort of commercial reality of it, that's where a lot of these challenges come in. And I think it's going to be a sort of, it's going to provide short-term opportunities, for example, where there are countries that do have excess hydropower, or where you have an aluminium smelter that's already been built, like some countries in Africa. So it's going to provide some short-term opportunities, but I don't think it's providing the sort of super long-term price signal that you would need to actually drive investment at the moment. And that's a bit of a market failure that, the EU and others need to look into.
One thing that seems to be quite certain is that the world is becoming more dangerous. And we've heard from the incoming president of America that looking to NATO members to spend more on their defense. Will the defense industry actually be a stronger off-taker, willing to pay premiums for secure supply chains?
I would like to think so for rare earths, because rare earth elements are very critical for defense. An F-35 fighter jet's got 420 kilograms of rare earths per jet. They're going to laser guidance systems. Your heat-seeking missiles have all got rare earth elements in them. Your submarines have got tons and tons of rare earths in there. So one would think that the US Defense Force would be prepared to pay a premium for that security. And that's very key, I think, which is one of the things Trump's focusing on. But unfortunately, the amount of rare earths that the defense industry uses are very small by comparison to what you have consumed by, let's say, plug-in hybrids, EVs, consumer electronics like your Apple phone or your earphones and your wind turbines. So yes, they would pay a premium, I think, but it's not enough to generate, for you to build a whole mine just to feed the American defense industry, because they wouldn't consume enough product. So it needs to be a combination of maybe led by American defense, but then maybe the US government putting pressure on some other consumers to also pay a small premium for a very critical mineral.
Yeah, just to add a bit to George's point, it all comes down to the economies of scale. For some of the minerals like your copper and others, you have it heavily used within the EV and the solar sort of value chain, whereas you see a bit more on the technological side of things with like the weapon systems and things like that. And if we just sort of step back a little bit and we looked at the geography from an African perspective, many of our countries would have probably the lithiums and the coppers and the cobalt and all of that, and a few of them have some of the rare earths, but they're few and far in between. So, for example, the DRC or South Africa with some of the platinum group metals. So I think really it comes down to what sort of application we're looking at it for. For the big, bulk minerals, fundamentally you'd need a much bigger market for that, and I don't think the defense industry necessarily would have the market that is needed to support heavy investment decisions.
Gareth.
So just building on the world becoming increasingly fractured, increasingly dangerous. I think this does play into Africa's interest in the CRM space, just from a competition perspective, right? So China are obviously miles ahead in terms of securing supply and in processing capacity, but you are seeing emerging interest from sort of EU, US, serious engagement from Saudi. It'll take African countries to really step up and be much more coordinated and strategic how they engage with them. But there is an opportunity there for African countries to leverage this competition in their interests. But it's going to require a sort of step up in capacity on the African countries' side to actually harness that to their benefit, I think.
Just going back to a comment that George made about some of the ancillary industries related to his business, the reagents. We've been talking a lot in recent weeks about added value for Africa and beneficiation, going further down the value chain. And there's sort of an emerging consensus that shouldn't be something that African countries should rely on. But George, what I was hearing from you is that there are some very specific areas where there can be a very significant advantage for African countries in some value chains. What's your view on the value added that Africa should invest in the minerals value chain?
I agree. I think you've got to pick your commodity where you can add value, because you need to be supported by the right industries. If you take Australia, they ship all their iron ore to China. They don't try and make steel in China in Australia because they can't compete with the Chinese. So there's certain minerals, I think, probably more the bulks that one should look at getting some beneficiation. But if you look at things like in the platinum sector, we should be able, we've got expertise in Africa to make autocats here rather than have them made in Europe, because the platinum industry is based here. Or the platinum mining is all in Southern Africa. As I've mentioned, there's I think the copper producers have got can probably go quite a long way down the value chain quite successfully, but they do really need reliable power, and they do need some of those key reagents. South Africa's got the ability to go downstream in most industries, but then you got to look at, can we compete with where the Chinese are like the steel industry, for instance, as I said. We have in South Africa, you have Metal Steel, but they are battling to compete with steel out of China. But so I think certain countries, as I mentioned, Morocco, I would think, I think the skills we can overcome quite easy because, Africa's proven they can skill up with training, I think, quite successfully. But it's more about the logistics and are those industries around to support the key support industries to go downstream, be it the chemical industries and so forth. And I think that's what you got to be able to, before you make that decision, which country can go have a mineral that you can go downstream with. You got to look at all those ancillary sort of support services before you say, well, before a government makes a declaration, if you're going to mine, you've got to, go downstream because it might not be possible to go downstream. So I think you've got to be realistic before you say, you've got to go downstream with this particular commodity.
And Gareth, just returning to energy, so all these things need energy. And thinking about cross-border collaboration, the idea of having regional collaboration and integration is a very laudable one and very seductive. And there are kind of one or two examples of economic corridors on the continent. But this seems to be the way to go. But how practical is it? How does that work? And what examples can we draw on to make that happen?
It goes back to the point of mining companies and associated industries tend to be much more solvent than national utilities. Historically, we've done a lot of work in the West Africa power pool, the East Africa power pool, looking at the Southern African power pool. One of the challenges in some of the early days of those power pools was that a lot of these agreements were government to government, utility to trade power, and really sort of best efforts. So the utility buying would often not pay, and the utility supplying would often not honor their supply agreements, and they'd sort of disintegrate, right? I think now you can bring in mining companies and other big off-takers into the market and have these markets not just be utility to utility, but power plant in one country to mining company in another country. That's really getting things to scale. So, for example, in Zambia last year, when the drought hit and the massive drop in the availability of hydro in Kariba, we did some work with the government to help them secure additional power to come in from Mozambique. I think you're looking at a lot of big hydro projects. So in Pandankur in Mozambique, for example, potentially going to be developed off the back of exports to power to other countries. But generally, it's not going to be to utilities. It's going to be much more to these solvent companies. And, hydro is not equally allocated across the continent. So this is, the ability to trade power across borders is becoming increasingly important.
A quick question we touched on this a little bit, but about ESG standards. We talked about this in regards to the decarbonation of supply chains, but the so-called Brussels effect, so Belgium as Brussels as a global regulator is having effect on upstream mining operations. Do we see this as an impediment to development of minerals in Africa, or is this a facilitator?
Yeah, well, look, I think it's a facilitator because I think Africa's got the opportunity. Well, for a start, all mining companies that are generally run by sort of listed entities and on global stock exchanges, and they all tend to adhere to very high, stringent ESG standards. So I think that's already in place with most of your major mines being run in Africa, certainly by Western producers. And so I think, we've got very high levels of ESG, and I think that is important because, we don't want some of these conflict metals being mined, like tin and tantalum and cobalt for that matter, in some of the Central African countries. So that's very negative, and the world doesn't want to source supply from they would term as conflict suppliers. So I think having very good ESG standards that will enable mines to successfully be able to sell their product without being derated for the fact that it might be from a conflict area. And I think we need to put more emphasis on that we can produce lots of these minerals, adhering to very good ESG standards. And I think that's a positive for countries or for companies operating in Africa.
Theo, have you a perspective on ESG standards and whether they should be set by Europeans and North Americans, or whether Africa should have its own sustainability standards?
I think whether they're set by Africans or Europeans, the bottom line is that it's something that the market, in some respects also is demanding, very much like what George was saying. So you look at many of the big mining companies on the continent, and they largely would be complying with these standards anyway. If you look at a respective country level, in many of the country legislations, you would have similar, it's not called ESG, but you would have some bit in the law that will talk about, for example, free, prior, informed consent. It will talk about meeting the environmental, doing impact assessments, doing the scoping, making sure that you're doing the proper local content and your supply chain is, pretty much above board. And I think you see that in a number of countries. So, and this is very much going to be the case going forward. I think what is also quite interesting on this ESG thing for me also becomes the traceability of some of the minerals, right, themselves. So we know that companies further down in the chain would buy these minerals and blend them and supply it to your Teslas or whatever of this world. And sometimes you do get, conflict minerals. Sometimes you do get all sorts of problematic minerals, mixing within that supply chain. And this is where some bit of work has got to be done, especially on the artisanal side of the mining industry, and then also the midstream players that buy these bulk minerals from some of the larger players. Those standards need to move beyond the mine and needs to be started to implement them within the wider value chain to ensure more traceability of the minerals.
And I have to declare a little bit of a bias because one of my organizations, the Impact Facility, works with artisanal and small-scale miners. But whether you think that the artisanal small-scale mining sector has a part to play in critical mineral development in Africa?
Well, I think it's very difficult because generally artisanal mining, and so I've come across artisanal mining in a number of countries in Africa. Unfortunately, they haven't got the economic sort of balance sheet, for want of a better word, to be able to adhere to very strong ESG standards. Unfortunately, that's just a fact of the matter. So, unfortunately, large-scale mining is generally does adhere to stringent ESG standards or environmental standards, and unfortunately, it's not generally not on the radar for artisanal miners. They just don't have the resources to be able to adhere to stringent ESG standards or comply with environmental standards of the particular country. So I don't think so. I might be wrong, but I'm happy to be proven wrong. I'd like to be proven wrong.
So we're coming near to the end of the podcast now. So the question is, are there any final comments you'd like to leave with our listeners when it comes to future-proofing African mining, perhaps on what else needs to be done to ensure that African nations benefit from the global critical minerals transition?
I mean, the good news is the things that Africa needs to do to really benefit and position itself at the forefront of this are a lot of the things that African countries need to do to drive their own development anyway, right? So it's political leadership, it's strategies led from the top that are long-term rather than based on short-term political expediency, proper strategies around where they want to position themselves in markets, clear policies, regulations, frameworks, and then you're going back to what George said, actual delivery across government, right? So across government, coordinating on investment, holding parties to account within the government, outside of government, really clamping down on corruption. Like it's these sort of basic things, linking through from strategy to smart policy that leverages the opportunities that they have, but is based in reality, frankly, in some of the conversations around downstream industry. And then being accountable, delivering, clamping down on these small issues like corruption and things that are actually holding back investment. I'd say that's what they need to do.
Hey,
yeah. So definitely, I mean the continent has the resource potential, and then as sometimes we say, resources are not, they become, and that goes back to the points we've been discussing, the policy and the regulatory frameworks to unlock the value for the continent, and ensuring that at the end of the day, Africa actually becomes one of the new hubs for these green industries and the critical minerals. You look at the statistics, and it was quite interesting that between 2016 and 2022, the sub-Saharan Africa got about 13% of the global greenfield FDI projects in metals and mining broadly. But when you break that 13% down, 73% went to extraction and only 26% went into manufacturing and processing. And this is the paradigm that a number of countries are seeking to change. And we've seen some offshoots of some of these green new industries emerging, but a lot more needs to be done to ensure that is strengthened across the board. So, for example, the need for the regionally coordinated industrial policies and financing becomes imperative, and then also strategies, that we would adopt to encourage both domestic and external foreign direct investment into these downstream value chains.
And George, your final thoughts for our listeners?
I mean, I agree. You need government and fiscal stability, which will drive investment by maybe the World Bank or the IFC into infrastructure and logistics. And of course, what we've touched on it many times is power and the cost of power and reliability of power. And that needs to be driven, as I say, from some government policies that interact together. And once again, is that government policies that one can rely on for the long term, because of, if you have changing fiscal terms, and so forth, how do you attract investment that you need a project to, first of all, the mining project takes on average 20 to 25 years to go from cradle to grave, which is discovery to production. And so that's 20 odd years of investment. And then you want that project to run for another 20 or 30 years, producing whatever it produces. So you need very long-term fiscal stability and very strong government that is going to support those industries and interact with other governments if they're looking to share power grids and so forth. So it needs a lot of the investment from governments and interacting together in a coordinated effort, to make sure that we can be successful on the continent across a number of countries, and not just one or two countries being successful, but helping all these countries that have strong mineral resources all develop together and to grow together.
This concludes the podcast in the TDI Sustainability Suits and Boots Special Mining Indaba series. Thank you to our speakers for joining us today. For our audience, please check out the rest of TDI Sustainability series of Mining Indaba podcasts on our Suits and Boots podcast site. Until next time, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you, or some of you, I hope, at the Mining Indaba in Cape Town.